Good evening, good morning. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and I welcome you on behalf of the members of our leadership team, which in addition to myself includes former Congressman Mel Levine and former Los Angeles County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky. I hope you all enjoyed a peaceful Thanksgiving. I've been traveling and had a great time, and now I'm happy to be back home and back to work. Welcome back, and many thanks to tonight's guest, David Leonhardt. David was on America at a Crossroads when his book, Ours Was the Shining Future, The Story of the American Dream, was first released. Now the book has been released in paperback, so we hope that you'll enjoy it as much as most of us did reading it. It's a great book, and it's a biography of the American Dream. The book is about the rise of the American Dream and its subsequent demise caused by what David calls a great stagnation. The book received accolades from all quarters, including the Financial Times, who selected the book as Best Book of the Year, by the New York Times Book Review, who included the book on its editor's choice list, and it was named one of the year's 10 best books by The Atlantic. So we'll give you a link later to be able to purchase the book. Thank you also to our wonderful moderator, Madeline Brand. We appreciate you so much. We want to thank our amazing audience for responding to our request for donations. You have ensured the sustainability of America at a Crossroads. Of course, if you have not yet donated this year, there is a donation link in every email. We are so grateful for your amazing encouragement and support, and we really value the notes that some of you send along with your donations. We're very grateful to you. We have an amazing December and January lineup. We have 3 more programs in 2024. Next week, we'll welcome the Atlantic's David Frum, who will give us his unique and informed perspective on the topic, Trump won, now what? And then the following Sunday, we have former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert in conversation with Nasser Al-Kidwa, former foreign minister of the Palestinian Authority, for a program entitled Two Former Leaders, an Israeli and a Palestinian, Offer a Path to Peace. We really encourage you to listen to that program and to get your friends to tune in. It should be a very interesting hour with Larry Mantle as the moderator. Lots of other programs. We're going to kick off January with the amazing Dr. Anthony Fauci. So, and then lots more great programs after that and before that as well. So just stay tuned into your emails and register for the programs. Now to introduce tonight's guest and to lead our discussion, please welcome the incomparable Madeline Brand. Madeline is well known to our America at a Crossroads audience. She is a radio broadcaster and personality for the past many years. For the last decade, Madeline has been the host of the news and culture show called Press Play on NPR's Southern California affiliate, KCRW. Madeline, the show is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Janice. It's so great to be back. I love doing these conversations because I can have such a long, in-depth conversation with one person. We can really get to the nitty-gritty of the particular topic. And I'm really super excited to talk to David Leonhardt because I begin every morning reading his newsletter, the New York Times Daily Newsletter, aptly called The Morning, that he edits. And then he often writes the first explanatory essay, which is actually a deeply reported story of the moment. And this morning, I learned that bird flu is something to watch, but not worry about too much yet. Anyway, so in all of his stories, he explains how we got here, the history, the political sides. It's great explanatory journalism. Also great explanatory journalism, as Janice indicated, is his book, Ours Was the Shining Future, The Story of the American Dream, in which he explains how we got to the point now where most people, or many people at least, do not believe in the American dream and what we can do to fix that. As a reporter, David has also won the Pulitzer Prize for commentary. And welcome back to America at a Crossroads, David.
Thank you, Madeline. And thanks for doing this. I appreciate it. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
My pleasure. So this topic, the topic of tonight's discussion, is how Democrats lost the working class. So first, I want you to just define what is the working class. Is it based on income? Is it based on education? Is it a cultural definition? How do you define the working class?
There's no perfect definition, but I think the most useful definition in the United States is people who do not have a 4-year college degree. And that's slightly more than 60% of American adults today. So it is the majority of the country. That includes many people who didn't attend college at all. It includes people who went to college but didn't get a degree, and it includes people who got a 2-year degree. Now, obviously, there's a real mix of people in that group. Some of them are wealthy, most of them are not. It includes nurses, it includes blue-collar workers, it includes people who work at Walmart and work in Amazon distribution centers, and the working class doesn't look the way it did 40 or 50 years ago. But whether you're looking at data on income or wealth or health or marriage or life expectancy or voting, as we will get to, you often see a real divide um, uh, down this line of do you have a 4-year college degree or not? And so that's why I think it's a useful definition.
Although people who have a 4-year plus college degree can vote with people, as we saw in this last election, with people who do not.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we live in a very diverse country, and there are certainly people with 4-year college degrees who vote Democratic and vote Republican, and there are people without 4-year college degrees who vote Democratic and vote Republican. I think one of the things that has become a real defining trend in this country, and we really saw it in this election, is the extent to which working class people have moved away from the Democratic Party. So it's the change that is really significant. And it's been going on a long time. We can talk about some of the history if you want. It's actually it is it's a kind of central part of the middle of my book. I realize that not everyone has time to read entire books, so if people are interested just kind of in that history of how the working class started moving away from the Democratic Party, I started around chapter 5 and tell that for about 3 chapters in the book, and it really begins a lot of it in the 60s with the student movement, with the anti-Vietnam movement, with the rise of the environmental movement. And the left in this country shifted from being a left that was much more based around labor unions and working class groups to being much more based among intellectuals and on college campuses. And that's really where we saw some of the shift. And to me, what was so interesting about living through this election, after having just written the book, was how many of the themes that I had learned in my research emerge in the 1960s and 70s. We've really now seen kind of hypercharged with today's Democratic Party and with Donald Trump. And initially, and I think this is something we may want to dive into, I leave it to you, but initially in the last decade, when Donald Trump first won, a lot of Democrats said, well, that's just white people who are bigoted. The white working class, we can't win them. And of course, Donald Trump supporters do include some bigoted people. Again, it's a big, diverse country. But we've since seen then that that is, at best, an incomplete explanation because we've now seen a very substantial shift of Black and a particularly Latino and Asian working class voters move away from the Democratic Party.
Okay, well, I was also really surprised and interested when I read your book to prepare for this conversation that I felt like I was reading some op-eds from now trying to talk about what happened to the election. Going back to 1962 and this Port Huron statement you see as a single an event that really a signal event that really changed the way the Democratic Party operated, because in the past it was seen as more of the party of the Archie Bunkers, and then along come the students. Tom Hayden in particular, I think many of us know him as a Californian and an ex of Jane Fonda's, but also as a leader of the SDS. And he was one of the student leaders at the time who really kind of gave the intellectual bones to this idea that the Democratic Party should shift towards the student activists and the more educated part of the electorate. Can you talk about that part?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I want to say that the new left, as it was known, did some really important and really valuable things. And I'll tell you, personally, I'm very grateful for SDS because I wouldn't exist without it. My parents met through work on SDS. And the idea of calling out the injustices of the Vietnam War, calling out the injustices of racism in this country, becoming an important part of the civil rights movement. There is a lot that the 1960s New Left did that I think is glorious and that history will remember very well and for good reason. But I think there were also some real strategic mistakes that the New Left made. And so you mentioned Tom Hayden and the Port Huron Statement. I'm sure many of the listeners know this was the kind of foundational document of Students for a Democratic Society, in which they talk about what the New Left should be. And the most important influence on it was C. Wright Mills, who had been a professor, who had died quite young, shortly before it came out. And C. Wright Mills had this vision that it was time to leave behind the notion of the progressive left as being based on the working class. He thought the working class was often backward, and he thought that there was a lot of exciting things happening in the United States and around the world among students. And again, he was right about some of that. The old left was too tolerant of Stalin and the Soviet Union. The old left and unions had some real problems of corruption. But the notion that the solution should be to move away from working class people and build a left that was instead essentially organized around intellectuals had a basic arithmetic problem, which is in the 1960s and even today, when we're more educated, you can't build an electoral majority that consists mostly of intellectuals. There aren't enough intellectuals in the United States to do that. As we just talked something like 35% of adults have a four-year college degree. So just starting there, the idea that you're going to kind of build a big political movement based in Berkeley, California, or Cambridge, Mass, the math doesn't work. And the left made a series of decisions, whether it was how harshly it criticized people who'd fought in Vietnam. One of the things I really focus on in the book is how much the left dismissed the idea that crime was rising in the 1960s. They didn't use the word misinformation, but today that's what they would have said. And they were just wrong about that. Crime really was rising in the 1960s. And so whether it was that, whether it was the approach of the environmental movement, whether it was aspects of the women's movement, a lot of it just sent a message to working class people. This isn't for you. And many of them responded by saying, "You're right, this isn't for us," and they shifted to first vote for Richard Nixon and later vote for Ronald Reagan.
But what about the reverse? Didn't they say the working class, or some of members of them, the ones who shifted to Nixon and Reagan and on, say, "I'm not with you because I'm not in favor of integration." There was the Southern strategy that Nixon employed. I don't want my kids bused. And a lot of that was, code for racism or racist attitudes that were about keeping segregation, at least in the South, but also in the North as well. There was a lot of opposition to integration, and there was a lot of discussion about, civil rights and also the war, of course, and that these, as you say, very valid issues. Why wasn't that worth separating from people who were not in favor of those issues?
Well, some of it I think was worth it. But I think one of the mistakes that Democrats made, and we've seen them make it again recently, is to say all of the opposition to our ideas is based on a combination of bigotry or ignorance. And so all the people moving away from us, they're doing it because they are racists, without actually looking at some other issues. As I talked about crime, it was legitimate for people to be concerned about rising crime in the 1960s and 70s. Crime in this country started rising around 1962. It rose really rapidly through much of the 60s. It rose in the 70s. It continued rising for much of the 80s. I grew up in New York in the 1980s. I know many of you are in Los Angeles. Certainly Los Angeles had a lot of crime. The idea of telling people, if you're worried about crime, by the way, a worry that extended across the Latino and Asian population was quite small in the 60s, but a worry that extended across white and black Americans. The idea of telling Americans, as the left did, if you're worried about crime, you're racist, I think was both wrong and a really self-defeating political strategy. It was absolutely rational to be worried about racism, to be worried about crime, and it wasn't necessarily all about racism. And so, yes, were there some voters the Democratic Party was going to lose because what they really wanted was segregation now and segregation forever, as George Wallace said? Absolutely. Did they have to lose the sheer number of voters that they did lose? No, they didn't. And you mentioned busing. That's another good example. I mean, how did busing play out, right? It played out in which relatively affluent people were mostly untouched by it, right? And working class people of both white and black races had to deal with this incredibly difficult issue, often of having your children bust out of your neighborhood into another neighborhood. You can be against that. You can say, you know what? I don't want my kid to leave the neighborhood school and get on a bus for a half hour every day. You can be against that without it just being about bigotry. And far too often, relatively privileged Democrats set about lecturing less privileged people about how their opinions were just wrong and out of bounds. And to me, it's not surprising that those people turned around and said, no, thanks, we're not on your team if you're going to treat us like that.
You write that the exception in that time period was RFK, not RFK Jr.,
Yeah, RFK.
RFK, and that he actually understood the crime issue very, very well, and in fact, campaigned on a law and order platform, which was also surprising as I read your book, because I think, along with many others, assumed he was quite liberal, which in many issues he was, but when it came to that, he sounded a lot like Richard Nixon.
Yeah, I think RFK is a heroic figure. And I think he's a heroic figure in part because he's become this liberal icon. And I think he deserves to be a liberal icon. But he was a liberal icon who was tough and who cared about winning and who didn't look down on working class people. And so by 1968, when he runs for president, he is the most popular white politician in Black America, because of the incredibly forthright stances he took in favor of civil rights. He also was the most conservative sounding Democrat on crime and law and order. He was conservative in other ways. He went to Notre Dame and he told the audience that he didn't think there should be student deferments for the draft. He delivered a nuanced message on Vietnam rather than making it sound like he was actually against the soldiers. He talked about farmers. And to me, this idea that actually the truest form of progressivism in this country is a version of progressivism that respects working class people, that has an agenda that is economically quite progressive, but socially is more moderate because that's where many working class people are. And because social moderation often is actually better for their lives, right? For working class people, it's not great to have millions of people entering the country through the southern border. It's just not, right? It strains social services. They're the ones who often have to compete for jobs. They're the one whose schools often get crowded. For working class people, it's not great to have rising crime. Crime tends to be higher in lower income neighborhoods. And so RFK really embraced this idea of kind of a tough, blue collar form of progressivism. His economic policies and his civil rights policies really were arguably the furthest to the left. And who knows what would have happened? I don't know that he would have even won the Democratic nomination if he hadn't been assassinated. But he had a shot. And I think he had a shot to win the presidency that year. It ended up being very close between Nixon and Humphrey. And once he was killed, the members of the party who were much more in favor of this kind of intellectually led new left really took over the party, symbolized by George McGovern in 1972. And Nixon just absolutely crushed McGovern in 72 by painting him as a friend of the three A's: abortion, amnesty for Vietnam draft dodgers, and acid, tying him to drugs. And that just isn't where the American majority was.
Right. So were RFK's views and his straddling these two worlds and this whole idea, was that pretty much abandoned by the Democratic Party?
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
No, there have always been tensions here, right? Not only that, but the Democrats who've won have almost always embodied a version of that kind of moderation and toughness. Bill Clinton obviously did, right? Bill Clinton made his whole identity about what a moderate Democrat he was, and he was a Southern Democrat, and he was going to be tough on crime. I think people forget just how moderate Barack Obama was in a lot of ways. In some ways that in hindsight are a little uncomfortable, right? I mean, he was against gay marriage when he ran for president. Um, he sent all kinds of signals that he was culturally moderate. He complained about people wearing their pants too low, saying that it bothered him to see people's underwear. There were columns, you can go back and find them, in which liberal columnists complained that he was way too centrist and preferred Hillary Clinton. In his 2008 Democratic Convention acceptance speech, he used the phrase illegal workers, a phrase no Democrat would use today, and said they were undercutting American wages, while at the same time decrying the separation of immigrant families. It was that kind of moderate message, both tough and humane. And so Clinton had a version of it. Obama absolutely had a version of it. And we can look this year. If you look at the Democrats who won tough races, so that's Alyssa Slotkin in Michigan, it's Ruben Gallego in Arizona, it's Jackie Rosen in Nevada, it's Tammy Baldwin in Wisconsin, it's some House members like Jared Golden in Maine and Marie Gluesenkamp Perez in Washington State, and I could name more in New York State and Ohio. If you go watch their ads, and I've spent a lot of time watching their ads, boy, did they make me think of RFK. Again, senior, not junior. They are super progressive on economics. They talk about how corporations are treating you unfairly. They're also really patriotic. They talk about the rivalry with China and how we have to stand up to China. And they're really quite moderate on social things. They make clear that they disagree with the Biden administration's loose border policies. They make clear that they're deeply concerned about crime. Ruben Gallego, who's a senator-elect from Arizona, you can Google it, went on Real Time with Bill Maher and delivered a riff about how incredibly offensive the term Latinx is because it takes the Spanish language and its tradition of having gendered language and tries to erase that tradition. You look at polling, most Latino members of this country don't like the term Latinx. Not all are offended by it, but more are offended by it or than are offended by Latino or Latina. And so if you look at the Democrats who have won, many of them employed a version of this RFK strategy, which is very progressive on economics, tough, patriotic, and making clear that they break with their party, with the kind of college campus version of their party on a set of social issues.
But then you have Bill Clinton with Don't Ask, Don't Tell, right? Which nobody liked.
No,
And
that was a mess.
that was a mess. So he was attempting to do that, right? Kind of be in the middle, socially moderate. So, Democrats, they can get in trouble by doing that, correct?
Okay.
And then when you look at some of the big areas of progress in this country, they have been policies that the Democrats have championed, gay marriage, for example. And maybe Barack Obama wasn't leading that charge, but others did. Gavin Newsom, one of them.
Yep.
So where do the Democrats need to, and the leadership in the Democratic Party need to lead on some of these social issues when the rest of the country is maybe not ready, but maybe in 5 years they will be?
So I think that's a really important distinction. I think there are a set of civil rights issues where it makes sense for the party to say, we're not compromising on this. And I think RFK is a really useful example there too, because for him, that was segregation. That was voting rights. There was no moderation from him on those issues when he was running for president. I mean, you can see it. There's a reason he was the most popular white politician in Black America. There's a great poll from 1968 where they polled Black Americans and they gave them all the candidates, and RFK finished first, and of course George Wallace finished last, and then you can kind of see the spectrum of other candidates on it, and it's fascinating to see. So absolutely, there should be things where a political party says, we're not going to compromise on this. This is part of who we are. And I would argue that gay marriage is exactly the kind of issue that it made sense for people to say they're not going to compromise on. I think it also might have made sense for Barack Obama to try to get ahead of the country if you look at the polling and do what he did. But that's a separate debate. There are absolutely issues like that. The problem is the number of things on which the Democratic Party has said, This is a position we have, and particularly kind of liberal activists have said, this is a position we have. And if you don't join us, we think that you're ignorant or hateful. So let's go through the list, including some in which I think it's clear Democrats were wrong in hindsight, right? The whole debate over closing schools, right? Closing schools in March of 2020 was almost certainly necessary. Then we get to the summer of 2020, and what happens? Well, I'm going to overgeneralize a little bit, but these patterns are correct. Private schools in blue America, where wealthy people send their kids, reopen for in-person classes in the fall of 2020. And public schools in red America reopen in the fall of 2020. But public schools in blue America stay closed for almost another year. And not only that, but often Democrats said that people who wanted to reopen schools were heartless and they didn't care about older people, or they even said, and you can find the quotes on this, that they were racist for wanting to reopen schools because the people who were most vulnerable would be people of color. We know in hindsight that the decision to keep schools closed for more than a year was a mistake. We know it did enormous damage to children, and we know it did disproportionate damage to Black and Latino children. So, in fact, I don't think the decision to close schools was racist in intent, but it was racist in effect. It had much bigger effects and much worse effects on Black and Latino families than it did on white and Asian families. The idea that the Democratic Party, or many Democrats, were so judgmental about those COVID decisions, to me, was a deep mistake. You can continue going down the list. I would argue that the question of whether someone should be able to choose what pronoun they're called and identify as they want is indeed a civil rights issue. And I understand why the Democratic Party would draw a hard line. I don't think the question of who can play high school sports is a simple civil rights issue. I think there are trade-offs. And I think saying you can choose whether you play girls or boys high school sports is certainly better for the trans kids who want to play with the gender they identify with. I also think trans girls often have physical advantages if they've gone through puberty, and allowing them to do it has downsides for other people. And so to me, this idea that the Democrats draw so many lines, we could do other ones, we could do immigration, we could do defund the police. You should draw some lines. You can't draw all lines.
I just want to pick up on the trans thing for a second, because part of that, it's hard to distinguish how big an issue this is in real life versus how big an issue it was made in the campaign and has been made in the past year or two in various states. And there are vanishingly small numbers of trans kids, and even fewer who are wanting to play in sports. So it's not exactly like gay marriage in terms of the amount of people and it being a civil rights issue. And yet it has been blown up into something like a stalking horse to really attack the entire Democratic Party, including Kamala Harris during the campaign. So I wonder if you can talk about that a little bit, about the other side using these issues as a way to vilify the Democratic Party and its leaders on issues that, frankly, most of the country wouldn't care about otherwise.
I have a slight power problem with my laptop, so I need 10 seconds to plug in a different power source. Can I have 10 seconds? I apologize.
Okay. Meanwhile, I'm going to read some of the questions and get ready to pose some of them to David.
Okay, I have climbed under my desk, but did it off video. So, and I'm now plugged in.
Okay.
So, look, I think there are two questions here. I think I alluded to this before in my answer, but I want to repeat it because I think it's important. The Republican Party has vilified trans kids and trans adults, and I think it is absolutely right for the Democratic Party, and for that matter, people who aren't in a party, to call out that vilification as what it is, which is vilifying human beings for who they are. It has a long and really nasty history in this country. It's a history that has affected gay people. It's a history that has affected Jews. It's a history that has affected Black people. It's a history that has affected Asian Americans, Mexican Americans. It's really ugly. And I think there's no excuse for it. And so I think it's really important to restate that. Now, with that said, I think that the issue of who can play sports is obviously a related issue, but that is not the same as vilifying people for who they are. There is strong reason to believe that people who have gone through male puberty have substantial advantages in sports. A simple way to think about this is people who've gone through male puberty are taller. In most sports, basketball, tennis, football, swimming, height is a major advantage. I'm not even talking about upper body strength or all kinds of other. And the Democrats and the left have done this slightly odd thing here, in which they've said this is a vital issue. They call it a human rights issue. That trans girls should be able to play girls' sports. They've said it's really important to us. And then they turn around and say, but actually, it doesn't really matter because almost none of them are doing it. And I don't think they can have it both ways and say, we care deeply about this, but also it doesn't matter. And I think they're factually wrong about it not actually mattering. And we saw this in collegiate swimming with Leah Thomas, the trans woman at Penn, who was a perfectly good but not great swimmer when she swam as a man. And then won, I believe, a national championship, but she was certainly one of the best swimmers in the country swimming as a woman. So let's think about how many people were affected by that. Everybody in that category who had spent years training and hoped to win a national championship was denied the right to do so. If you talk to people in the world of swimming, women swimming, you will hear how frustrated so many of them are and how unfair they think it is. And then you look at the numbers about the increase in the number of trans Americans, and you start to multiply that out. Anytime you have another version of that in an individual sport, it could end up dominating the whole sport. In sports where a single person can play a huge role in a team game, a pitcher in softball, a single player on a basketball court, it really could end up having a major, major effect on girls' sports. And so to me, for people who want to argue that trans girls should be allowed to play girls' sports even after going through male puberty, I don't think they can make the argument that actually it doesn't really affect anyone. I think they have to that it doesn't confer any advantage, which I believe is inconsistent with the facts. Or I think the most honest argument is it probably does confer a substantial advantage in many situations, but we believe the right of someone to compete as they identify is greater than the right of other girls and women not to compete against that person. I think that's the most honest argument in favor of it. I don't think it's an argument that's going to persuade most Americans, but I think it's the most honest argument in favor.
Okay, yeah, so I don't want to spend a whole bunch on the trans issue, but I think also it's also a question what you're getting at, which is interesting as well, is about messaging. And the Democrats, at least in this last election and maybe in the previous elections too, seem to have sent the message to these working class voters that went to the Republicans that we don't care about you, that we don't really want your vote. I guess I'm trying to understand that, especially in the context of this last election, when you can argue that Joe Biden was the most pro-working class president in many, many cycles, right? More so than Obama or Clinton, even in terms of the policies that he enacted. Was it just a question of not selling them properly to these voters, not telling them that we are doing this for you. We are putting in high, internet service in rural areas for you. A lot of the Inflation Reduction Act will directly benefit the voters who voted for Trump.
Yep. I think it's sort of a mix of different things. Some things I don't think were about campaign strategy or tactics, or at least it was too late to change them by the time we got to the last few months of the campaign. Inflation was really high. That was mostly not Joe Biden or Kamala Harris's fault. Some of it was their fault, but it was mostly not their fault. You look around the world, inflation was high across Europe as well. And people are angry. Working class people in particular are angry across much of the wealthy world. And you see incumbent parties not being kicked out of office everywhere. Incumbent parties just won in Ireland, but you see them being kicked out in a lot of parts of the country. And so to some extent, we should just acknowledge that that was going to be really difficult for the Democrats to overcome no matter what. Then they had a second problem, which is both of their candidates were pretty weak candidates. Joe Biden was running for re-election at 82. Throughout, polls showed that most voters didn't want him running for re-election and thought he was too old. The Democratic Party was fairly dismissive of those polls. They got mad at the media for writing about Biden's age. I actually think, in retrospect, there's an argument we didn't write about it enough. But I know many people in the Democratic Party thought we wrote about it too much. The polls were consistent. People looked at Joe Biden and they said he should not serve a second term. And then, for a combination of reasons, how long he waited to step down, how he did it when he stepped down, the party was left with Kamala Harris, who is a politician who has some really big skills. She's a great debater. She thumped Donald Trump in the debate. She thumped Mike Pence in the debate 4 years ago. We've seen her debating skills when she was a Judiciary Committee member in the Senate, and she would ask questions of Bill Barr and Supreme Court nominees. She's really good at that. She's not good at a lot of other parts of electoral politics. She's not great at describing her vision. She's quite weak at interviews. Obviously, the signature moment was she didn't give many interviews, and in one of them, she was asked how she differed from Joe Biden, and she said nothing comes to mind. She just doesn't seem to have thought about what she would want to use the presidency for in the way that Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and Bill Clinton have. She's a prosecutor and a lawyer. And she has absolutely no history of having won swing voters, right? She was elected in San Francisco and then California, and really has no history of ever appealing to swing voters. And so the party was running in a tough race. Both of its candidates, I think, were fairly weak. Having said that, I agree with you that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris's administration did a lot of stuff designed to help working class people. But they also rejected the views of working class people in some pretty major ways. The biggest is immigration. The surge of immigration in the Biden administration is the largest on record. It's something like 8 to 10 million people on net who have entered the country during his presidency. His policies were the main reason. And if you doubt that, just look at the fact that when he cracked down 6 months ago, the amount of immigration absolutely plummeted at the border. The government can have a huge effect on immigration. Working class people across races hated that policy. They hated the apparent unfairness of it, people skipping the line. They hated the fact that it was leading to strains on social services. You go watch some of the town halls in Denver and Chicago about how angry people were about this. You go look at what happened to the counties in South Texas that are on the front lines of this immigration surge. These are places Hillary Clinton won in landslides that Donald Trump won this year. And so whether it's that, whether it's some of these social issues, it is true that on straight economic policy, although you can argue immigration is economic policy too, on straight economic policy, Joe Biden did a lot of really good things for working class people. And so you can argue that they were voting against their pocketbook interests. But I would just add, rich people vote against their pocketbook interests all the time. Right? The wealthiest parts of LA, Aspen, Colorado, Martha's Vineyard, Scarsdale, New York, San Mateo, San Francisco, all those places voted strongly for Democrats, even though Donald Trump will cut their taxes much more than he will cut the taxes of working class people. And so I understand why people don't just vote on pocketbook stuff, but also vote on values and on a sense of who reflects my values and my desires on things like social policy.
So what is more important then? Because, your book talks a lot about how early on in this country, when America was great again, and there was a much lower income disparity, and the top marginal tax rate was something like 92%,
Yeah.
that there was a feeling of shared prosperity, of the shared need for everyone to do well economically, and that really worked, despite the differences in opinions on social policy. America's CEOs decided to band together and work to elevate workers' salaries just to save capitalism. So I guess I'm wondering where people align, like when they're in the voting booth, are they really looking at who's making my life better economically? Or because a lot of people thought that the Trump administration was better for them economically. Or are they saying, this guy talks like me, thinks like me, has said things that I say around the dinner table that I really believe?
I think it's both. And I think part of the problem for the Democrats this year was both were real weaknesses, right? Both the inflation of the last 4 years, and people looked at things like um, some of the COVID restrictions. It's interesting, Texas began swinging toward Trump in 2020, even though he lost. And there was an analysis by a progressive group, I think it's called Equis, of why Latinos in particular began shifting toward Trump in 2020. And it highlighted two things above all, immigration, and that Trump was in favor of reopening the economy more quickly than Democrats after COVID. And so I do think that Democrats really are paying the price for a period of sort of intense cultural foment and intense cultural leftism, um, from roughly 2019 to 2022. Nate Silver talks about this as well. So whether that's defund the police, whether that's the idea of decriminalizing hard drugs in Oregon, whether it's the kind of we need to have mask mandates forever and keep schools closed for a year, whether it's the idea that the Democratic Party went from having a very moderate message on immigration under Barack Obama to having the Democratic Party's platform in 2020 said nothing about border security. It was all about making it easier to enter this country, including for people who didn't have legal permission to do so. That's what the whole platform was about. And so I think a lot of voters responded to that combination of issues and said, whoa, they seem to, first of all, I don't really think I agree with this. And second of all, this isn't the stuff that is my top concern. Again, though, there is a lot of good news out there for the Democratic Party, despite the drubbing they just got, which is Donald Trump didn't win by that much, despite all this. And there were a set of Democrats who won, even under these circumstances. I've named them before, right? They're the four senators who won really tough races. There are even some people like Sherrod Brown who lost but ran way ahead of Harris. Dan Osborne in Nebraska lost but ran even more ahead of Harris. And then the bunch of House members I mentioned. And when you look at the way they ran, it's incredibly similar. And it's different from the way Harris ran. They didn't talk about abortion, which is a really good issue for people who are already going to vote Democratic anyway, and doesn't do that much to sway people who are in the middle. They didn't talk about Donald Trump being a fascist. Again, a really good issue for people who are already going to vote Democratic, does almost nothing to persuade people in the middle. They talked about pocketbook issues. They were populist. They said they're going to stand up to the big corporate bosses who are making your life hard. And they said they're going to stand up to the radical leftists. Some of their ads even use that phrase. And so you kind of look at this message, you think about how similar it is to Barack Obama and Bill Clinton, and yes, RFK in 1968. And I actually think I'm not saying it's easy, but I think the broad outlines of a Democratic Party message that resonates are sitting there in plain sight if we're willing to look at them.
Yeah. And so what you're saying is return to, and I've heard Rahm Emanuel say something similar in your newspaper, for example, and other places. I guess he is sort of running to be the next head of the DNC. But he is basically saying, what was wrong with the Clinton era? You don't like prosperity. You don't like, America being respected in the world. You don't, and basically saying, why don't we return to this centrist vision? Is that something that the Democratic Party would consider, is being more of a, kind of a blue dog Democratic Party of yore, kind of what you've talked about? And would that work now? We are a long time away from the Clinton era, and things have changed radically. Would it even work to be centrist? Or, in fact, is that not populist enough, at least on the economic front?
I think it's not. So that I have enormous regard for Rahm. I know him pretty well. He really does have a very impressive record of winning, of helping the Democratic Party win hard elections. Um, uh, but I do think today's Democratic Party, and actually, if you listen to Rahm, I think he actually might, I don't want to speak for him, but he might even agree with this. I think it has to be more populist than it was under Bill Clinton. Look, I actually think that the message that I think gives the Democratic Party the best chance of winning is clearly to the left of where the Democratic Party was 30 years ago. Clearly, right? Like just think about gay rights for that matter, right? Think about basic protections for trans people. And then I also think the Democratic Party needs to take a different approach to trade than it did 30 years ago. Bill Clinton, for all his skills, said some things about trade and globalization that have aged incredibly poorly. I mean, he has this line where he says China is going to try to keep out the free internet. Good luck with that. That's like trying to staple Jello to the wall. Well, turns out the Chinese Communist Party found a stapler that manages to keep Jello on the wall, right? And the kind of notion that if only we open up our system through NAFTA, through giving China most favored nation status, that we'll become rich and they'll become free, just hasn't happened. And so I don't think it's simply a matter of rerunning the Bill Clinton playbook. I don't think it's a matter of simply rerunning the Barack Obama playbook. I also think there is real wisdom in both of those things. And to put it more sharply a little bit on some of the social issues, there is no Democrat in the country who has managed to win a tough race without running to the center on these social issues. There just isn't. You don't see people like Elizabeth Warren, another person for whom I have great respect, winning in purple districts. You don't. You don't see people like AOC. You do see people like the original Bernie Sanders, who was moderate on gun rights and was in favor of pretty tough border security and said there's a reason CEOs want more immigration. You do see people like him winning in tough places, but you don't see today's version of Bernie Sanders, who's essentially unwilling to pick any fights with any parts of the left, winning in purple house districts or in states. The people who win in those states, go look at their ads. Go look at Alyssa Slotkin. Go look at Raphael Warnock in Georgia. Look at Ruben Gallego in Arizona, Jackie Rosen. You can YouTube, Google all these ads and watch them. They're really worth watching to see what kind of Democrats won, even in this tough environment.
Okay, let me go to some of the questions. A lot of the questions are about kind of a variety of the what's the matter with Kansas idea of why would people vote against their self-interests when the Democrats are the ones who are providing the working class with the kinds of benefits that they enjoy. Why would they vote against that? Which I think you've answered in terms of the cultural question.
Just briefly, two things. A lot of affluent people vote against their short-term
Right.
economic interests, right? But I do think that there are some issues that Democrats need to grapple with, which is the extremely high immigration of Joe Biden's tenure really hurt the economic interests of working class people. You go look at or read the articles or watch the town halls and public meetings in Chicago and in Denver where people are coming forward. By the way, many of them are not white. People are coming forward and they're saying, this is too much of a strain on our community. Homelessness has risen. We don't have the city services we need. Our school system suddenly has an influx of new kids and the teachers don't have time to work with my kids. That really is working against the interests of working class people. And I promise you, in well-off neighborhoods, those are not the neighborhoods that really experienced the effects of this enormous surge. There's a fantastic article in New York Magazine. I apologize, I'm forgetting the author's name, but you can find it online. It was a big story about how Trump did so much better in New York City than in the past. And the reporter went out to Queens, to neighborhoods that had moved to the right, and he interviewed people there and he asked them. And when you listen to their voices, you don't hear people who are saying, basically, all I care about is social issues. You hear people talk about their day-to-day quality of life, and maybe they're wrong that Donald Trump is going to be better for them. They may well be, but it is entirely rational, and to me, based on the reality of the last 4 years, that they look at some of the turmoil in their neighborhoods, and they say, we want to change.
Okay. Here's a question from Irvin, who says, since McGovern, the nation has adopted changes which help the working class, such as abortion, higher minimum wages, and improvement in the standard of living, including under Clinton and Obama. Is the working class angry because of the impact of technology, which wiped out many working class occupations? So, yeah, we haven't talked about that per se, the global economic changes. And I would tack on to that the incredible amount of money spent on lobbyists, lobbying, and on campaign contributions as part of this that gives people the idea that the deck is stacked against the regular
Yeah.
person.
Technology is a really hard thing to think about because obviously there's been a lot of technological change. I'm 51 years old. There's been a lot of technological change in my lifetime. But there's usually a lot of technological change. And in fact, when I think about how much the world has changed since 1973, when I was born, I actually think it's changed less than it changed in the 50 years before that. So if you think of America from 19, well, let's say 74 to keep it round. America changing from 1974 to 2024 versus how America changed from 1924 to 1974. It's kind of useful for me because my grandmother was born right around 1924, so I can think about it in terms of her life. Did it change more in the first 50 years of her life or the first 50 years of mine? It's certainly not obvious to me that it's changed more in the first 50 years of my life. When you think about the South getting electrified, when you think about the rise of air travel, when you think about the spread of television. I mean, and so technological change has always been there. I think what's what's important to think about is that sometimes technological change can go with broadly rising living standards, as happened between 1924 and 1974. And sometimes technological change accompanies stagnation of living standards for large numbers of people, as has happened the last 50 years. So I think technology has played a role, but I think it's less the fact that there's been technological change and more that we haven't adapted to it in ways that have helped kind of the masses of workers. And one thing that I often argue is economic statistics are great. I've spent much of my career as an economic journalist, but it's important not to restrict ourselves to economic statistics. And when you look at statistics on life expectancy, which in some ways are just a much more basic measure of our country, they really leave no doubt that the last few decades have not been good decades for this country, and particularly for people who don't have a four-year college degree. In the 1980s, we had a kind of normal life expectancy for a high-income country. Today, we have the lowest life expectancy of any high income country in the world. It's not particularly close. And the overwhelming reason is that while life expectancy has continued to rise for people who were fortunate enough to have a four-year college degree, it is really flatlined even before COVID for people who don't.
Mm. A lot of that is, as you report in the book, because of an incredibly lowered top marginal tax rate and corporate taxes that, as I said earlier, went from 92% to what is it now, in the lower 30s?
High 30s, yeah.
Yeah. So, and that money was used to jumpstart investment, or that made everyone's lives better. The highway system, for example, investment into technology that brought us the internet, although you can debate whether or not it was a good thing. Um, well, it's a conversation, so yeah, maybe a good thing in some ways. But that the government was doing stuff that helped everybody, and still does in some respects, but not in the way that people understand it. Just driving around Los Angeles, you can tell it's dirtier. The streets don't, they're full of potholes. As you say, flying in an airplane or taking a trip across the country takes as long now as it did 60 years ago. So
Crazy.
it's crazy. So a lot of those economic policies were put in place by the Republicans after Reagan and onwards, and obviously Clinton as well. So why hasn't that been a rallying point, that a lot of the working class, a lot of Americans are angry at the elite? They're angry at the fact that there are so many billionaires seemingly controlling our lives in many ways. And why isn't there a movement, and who would lead that movement to rejigger the way that we tax and spend and make this a more equal country? Wouldn't that go a long way to bringing back the working class and everyone else into the democratic fold?
I think so there's the economic effect and the politics. I do think that a higher marginal tax rates could have a substantial effect on inequality and bring inequality down, and help lift living standards for people who have less money. I don't think it can be the full solution. There's some really interesting research about how actually what people really want is not so much after-tax benefits, but they want to make a good wage for themselves before taxes because it gives them dignity in a way that receiving benefits after tax doesn't. The notion is pre-distribution of income rather than redistribution. So I don't think taxes are everything. But I agree with you. What you're suggesting in your question is that some of these economic inequality issues and tax issues really have the potential to be a big advantage for the Democratic Party. And I totally agree with that. The minimum wage, raising it, not there's a limit, but raising it is quite popular. It's passed, minimum wage increases have passed even in red states. Raising taxes on corporations, that's also really quite popular. And so when you kind of are sorting through the issues, and you're thinking about which are the issues that are advantages for the Democratic Party, those issues can absolutely be advantages for the Democratic Party. I think in the era of Trump, they've had two big problems. First, the Democratic Party has gotten so far away from public opinion on a long list of issues. One way to think about this is Democrats like to point out how far from public opinion Republicans are on abortion. And that's true. Republicans are way out of step with public opinion on abortion. But I actually think the list of social issues in which Democrats are out of step with public opinion is longer than the list of social issues on which Republicans are, starting with immigration. And the party's trying to pivot now, but you can't just pivot by saying different things in a campaign. So the first thing is there have been a long list of social issues where Democrats have gotten way out of step with public opinion. Some of them are silly, like renaming schools that have been named for Abraham Lincoln, but people still hear about that and they think, no thanks, I don't want to be part of that. But then there's something else that Trump did that in some ways is underappreciated. Yes, in some ways, Trump is a far-right figure, right? The way he talks about using the power of government to punish his enemies and help his friends. His history of saying racist things, the way he lies, the way he tries to turn the media and any of his critics into scapegoats. Those are all far-right things. But on economic policy, Trump moved the Republican Party substantially to the left, right? He said that all those trade deals that both Republicans and Democrats signed were terrible, and I'm not going to do that anymore. And he said this kind of elite consensus around more and more immigration being great is wrong, and I'm going to stop it. And so while it's true that kind of populism and economic progressivism is mostly popular in this country, and that largely redounds to the benefit of the Democratic Party, the Democratic Party has other weaknesses, and Trump has muddied the water in ways that I think go underappreciated by just how much he moved to the center on trade, immigration, and things like Social Security and Medicare, which he basically said, I'm not going to touch, unlike Paul Ryan.
Okay, so we're almost running out of time. Someone has asked, and I'm sorry, I've lost your name, but anyway, I'm asking for you. Who is the leading person who can lead the Democrats out of the wilderness and back into the majority?
I don't have a single name, but you heard me earlier saying that Kamala Harris had no record of winning over swing voters. And I would encourage the Democratic Party to look at people who have a record of winning over swing voters. So there are some very talented politicians who don't have a record of winning over swing voters. Gavin Newsom, Pete Buttigieg. Really kind of no record of winning over the kind of people who decide presidential elections. There are also a whole bunch of high-profile Democrats who have a very strong record of winning over people who decide elections. Gretchen Whitmer, Josh Shapiro, Raphael Warnock, Alyssa Slotkin, Ruben Gallego. The list could go on and on and on. There are Democrats who have won tough races. I think Abigail Spanberger, who's going to be running for governor in Virginia next year and won one of those tough House districts, is another person who you may soon be hearing lots about. But to me, the idea that if you want someone to do a job, you should hire someone who's done versions of that job before, is a pretty good piece of advice for managing in the workplace. It's also a pretty good piece of advice when you think about who you might want to choose as your party's candidate.
What is your prognosis? I know it's terrible to ask journalists or anyone for the crystal ball,
Oh, but
but
it's irresistible, right?
a lot of people are wondering, is this a generational issue or can it be fixed in the next election?
Oh, it certainly can be fixed in the next election. I mean, I think it's important to remember that in 2004, people were talking about a permanent Republican majority, which was wrong. And just 8 years later, in 2012, they were talking about a permanent Democratic majority, which was also wrong, right? Um, uh, and so it is absolutely the case. First of all, Democrats will be favored to do well in the midterms, in part because the party is now so much more affluent, and affluent people tend to vote more in midterms as opposed to presidential elections when kind of everyone votes. And I absolutely think Democrats have a very good chance to make gains in 2 years and to win the presidency back in 4 years. But I do think the biggest impediment to the party is the kind of wishful thinking. The Democratic Party is engaged in a lot of wishful thinking. It told itself that abortion would be the thing that would win the 2024 election because many Democrats are passionate about reproductive rights. Well, that was wrong. Kamala ran hard on reproductive rights, and she lost. It told itself that the way to win was talking about the protecting the future of democracy. That was wrong. And so I think one of the key things is for Democrats to care a little bit more about winning and care a little bit less about what makes them feel good about themselves as a party. That's one thing. And then another thing is to look at public opinion data not as you want it to be. Don't go find the one poll that asks a question in a way that's convenient to what you believe. Go look at public opinion as it really is on a set of these issues and then be introspective about all the ways that the Democratic Party really is out of step with public opinion. The best news for the Democratic Party is today's Republican Party is dysfunctional in a bunch of ways. It itself is out of step with public opinion in a bunch of ways. Donald Trump is probably going to run an administration that has a lot of corruption and offers a lot of opportunities for criticism. And so if Democrats can shore up their weaknesses and care a little bit more about winning, and less about feeling good and looking down on the other side, I think they can be in an excellent position to do well in both the 2026 and 2028 elections.
All right. Thank you so much. That was a fascinating hour, and I appreciate your time and your wisdom and just everything about you.
Thanks for the great questions, for the great conversation. Thanks to everyone who wrote in with good questions.
Yeah, the great questions, and sorry I didn't get to most of them. The book is called Ours Was the Shining Future by David Leonhardt, and it is now in paperback. So go get it. And next week, join David Frum and Larry Mantle for the conversation entitled Trump Won, Now What? And on Sunday, December 15th, the former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert will be in conversation with Nasser al-Kidwa, former foreign minister of the Palestinian Authority. So join us for those two programs and all the rest of them. Thank you very much for joining us this evening, and I will see you soon.